Hi Victory Stitches, welcome back to our series on how to read and decode a sewing pattern. Today, in this video, we are going to look at notches. They can cause some problems if you don't get how they work, but don't worry, by the end of this video you'll be able to notch up another victory to add to your collection of sewing skills. We can do this! Welcome back to my sewing room. This week we're going to do a very simple demonstration on notches, and I'm using Butterick 6248, and we're using this one here, which is demonstrated on my mannequin Dolly. Now this is the completed version of the top, and we're going to be looking at the princess seam, which is a seam that runs down through the centre of the bust and down to the hem, one on each side. So we actually have one pattern piece here, which is the centre front, and then two side fronts. And I've cut out some material using scraps, and because I only had a few scraps left over, I haven't cut out the full length because I don't have enough. So we're just going to be working with some sample pieces to see how we can get this seam looking nice and neat. There are notches in here that need to be matched to get the seam looking good, and that is what we're going to do down in the cutting room. Welcome back to my cutting room. Now you will recall last week when we saw a pattern piece, we had this double line here which is for lengthening or shortening the garment. This piece here is the front side, and I have already cut out the centre front piece, and for the sake of this instruction today I'm not going to be doing the whole piece, which is why I've actually got all this pattern hanging off the end. I'm actually just working with scraps left over from the garment that I showed you earlier that I'd made a wee while ago. So I'm going to use this lengthening and shortening line as my boundary. So I'm just going to fold it up on here, just as the bottom of my piece, just for the sake of this tutorial. Make sure that I can see the rest of the pattern as well, because otherwise I'm going to be stuck. So I'm just going to put it like that. Now we've got quite a few notches here. We've got a double notch over on what will be the side seam. Up here we've got a single notch. This is where the sleeve would join in. And this line here is the princess line. This is the line that goes down the centre of the bust. And I've got two single notches there. They match up with the centre front, which I'm just going to bring on camera now. They match up with these two notches here. This line is the centre front, and it is meant to be folded, as you can see from the double-ended arrow. I didn't have enough scrap fabric, so I've just cut along there. Because all we're actually worrying about today is this seam and how to match up the notches. This is going to be sewn to this. So these two notches will match those other two. We've got notches up on the top of the shoulder, which will match to a back piece. We've got notches in the neck, which will match to one of the options on this pattern with a cowl neck. So there's notches all over the place, so I thought this would be a really good place to start looking at them. But for now we're just going to worry about that one seam, and that's that princess seam. So with this piece I've already cut out, I've actually cut out the notches as little sticky out bits here. I'm not sure how clearly they're coming up on the camera. So they poke out like little triangles poking out. And what I'm going to do with the piece that I've pinned over here, I'm actually going to cut that out without cutting it like that. I'm going to do it the different way. This is what I call the lazy way, which is how I tend to operate. Unless I absolutely have to cut them out with pointy bits, I tend not to. It's entirely up to you which way you do it. Find out which works for you best. I'm just going to cut this pattern now. This fabric that I'm using today is a stretch knit jersey fabric, and I've deliberately picked a pattern and fabric that work together like that because it is easier to work in those sort of curves on a princess seam with a stretchy knit fabric. It's got a lot more give than a woven fabric. when you've got a woven fabric, what you're actually doing, whether it's woven or not, is you're actually trying to join an outer curve like this one to an inner curve like that one. And the material, unless it stretches a bit, can be quite resistant, which is why you end up having to cut little snips into the fabric to get them to work, and that is something for another tutorial. So we'll try and keep it as simple as we can today. Right, here we are back at the sewing machine. So I've laid out the two pieces. This is the centre front, and that would be the centre front of the garment here. This is the princess seam, which is also this one here on the side front. So we're going to attach this to this, and here is our side seam. So right sides together. Now the first thing I do when there are notches to match up is I match those notches. So remember, one piece I've got sticky out ones and the other ones I've got the little snips cut into it. Only because I want to show you that both options. So I'm going to match those two there, keeping my raw edges even, obviously. And I'm going to place a pin in there. It holds that in place. I'm going to do the same with the other notch up here, which matches up with that one. Keeping those raw edges even. Now the reason I place my pins perpendicular to my seam line is simply because I can actually, if I sew nice and slowly, I can actually stitch over them without having to pull them out beforehand. Just makes the whole process a little easier. Right, so these two pieces here are joined together by the notches at the moment. One piece is actually a little bit bigger. The one with the more sort of rounded curve, there's actually a bit more length than there is in the other one. This is why I've chosen to show you using a knit fabric, because we can stretch this to meet the other one. I'm just also going to match up the rest of here. So I'm going to match down to the bottom here. And I'll just put another pin in there. And just ignoring that gap at the moment, I'm just going to finish up here as well. So we've got at the end, we're going to match those edges. Let's put a pin in there and another one halfway down. That just leaves us with the notched area to tackle. So if I pull this, I'm going to be able to make it meet up with the other one. If I had a fabric that was just a woven fabric and not a knit fabric, so it wouldn't have any stretch, any amount of pulling is not going to help. And that's when you would start snipping in like this, just a little bit in, just to give a little bit of extra room to kind of maneuver the fabric around. I think those little snips will actually help me with my stretch fabric as well, but I'm just going to pull that. That's about halfway there. I'm just going to marry up with that bit there. Place a pin. You can see by pulling it in, it's meeting up. And again with the other half. Because remember, a pattern is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object, hence all the curves, and some curves are bigger than others. When this is stitched, it will give the curve that will fit over the bust. You wouldn't have a seam like this for a man's garment because they don't have that extra room in that area to actually work around. Right, so we've got everything pinned. Now we're going to take it to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch that seam. Now remember, our seam allowance in this garment is 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to match that up with the 5/8 mark on my stitch plate. Bring that presser foot down. I'm actually not going to backstitch here because I'm using a stretch seam on my fabric here because I'm working with knit fabric. If I didn't use a stretch seam and just used an ordinary straight seam, I would actually risk those stitches getting broken as the garment's pulled on and off and gets stretched. So with my stretch seam, it goes back and forth a little bit. It's like a kind of a zigzag. If you don't have that option on your sewing machine, just use a very narrow zigzag. It will achieve the same effect. It gives give to your stitching. But if I try to back stitch with this stitch, it just doesn't like it. So I'm just going to start her up. I'm just going very carefully over that first pin. Now remember, we are sewing a curve, so we've just got to make sure we steer correctly and make sure everything is nice and flat, because the two pieces are not the same, so they might be bunching up. Just make sure that whatever's going through the machine is not puckered, it's nice and flat, otherwise you will end up with pinched and puckered seams on one side or another. I'm approaching the curve, so I'm just gently steering that fabric round. I've now moved past that second notch. The rest is slightly curved but fairly straightforward, so I'll probably put the speed on, go on Spitfire mode, and I'll meet you back here when I finish the seam. Princess seam done, notches are matched up and everything. So we will just open this up to get an idea, and there you can see the nice, even, unpuckered princess seam. I'm just going to take this over to Dolly so we can just show you in a bit more 3D detail, because this flat table's not the best to show a curved seam on. Please excuse Dolly for being half topless, she only had time to put on half a garment. So here's what we've just sewn. I've just pinned it on so you can see here's the princess line and how it curves over the bust. So we've got that three-dimensional thing happening now. And if we had not matched those notches, which would be about here and here, we could have ended up with the wrong amount of ease and the wrong amount of give, with all sorts of wobbly lines and puckers and all sorts of things going on. But because we did those notches first and we matched everything up to where it was supposed to go from one piece to the other, we've ended up with a perfect princess seam. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to check out last week's video on the introductory part of how to read a sewing pattern, but there'll be tips and techniques coming up every week at this stage for sewing pattern decoding. So don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends, go on Facebook as well at Stitch to Victory on Facebook, and I will see you again next week. Bye!